Thank you, Bill. So this is the second in a series of talks about the Vineyard's 4 waterfronts and about the intersections between land and water and the things, boats, buildings, lives that people built there. Every one of these 4 waterfronts is different, and the thing about Oak Bluffs is that, it works, is that Oak Bluffs, alone among the waterfronts on the Vineyard, was created almost entirely by human activity. There is no great deep water harbor like Vineyard Haven. There is no shallow inlet and sheltered bay like Edgartown, not even a pond with a winding tidal estuary like there was in Menemsha before they dredged it out in 1902. There's a saying, which given my name I'd like to have said I heard from my grandfather from the old country. Actually, I got it from a National Geographic special. The Dutch like to say, God made the world, but the Dutch made Holland, a reference to their flood control and dikes and whatnot. In much the same way, while I take no official position on the origins of the earth for the purposes of this talk, the citizens of Edgartown, later Oak Bluffs, most certainly made Oak Bluffs as a town and made the Oak Bluffs waterfront. Thereby a very brief history of how we got there. People from the get-go came to what's now Oak Bluffs to get away, to rest, relax, recharge, disconnect from the world. Originally to commune with God under the oak trees in what had been the back corner of somebody's back of beyond pasture in northern Edgartown, and returning there year after year, August after August, from 1835 on, building cottages, some of which were rather larger than the term cottage might actually call to mind, and ultimately building an iron tabernacle in 1879 when putting up and down 5,000 square feet of sailcloth started to get to be too much of a drag. The Baptists, who were playing the theological version of Coke versus Pepsi with the Methodists throughout the 19th century on the Vineyard, decided that this whole camp meeting thing sounded like it had potential and established their own campground and their own wooden tabernacle in the Oak Bluffs Highlands on the shores of what was then called Lake Anthony. If you've ever wondered why there's a big empty round space in the map just north of Washington Park, it used to have a Baptist tabernacle in it. And then, as always seems to be the case in vineyard history, came the developers, the smart guys with a lot of money in their pocket, and the idea that if you could carve up pieces of undeveloped land, you could sell it a quarter or a half or a whatever acre at a time to people who wanted to own their own little bit of paradise, or at least rent it for a couple of weeks. Thus came the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company, who hired landscape architect Robert Copeland, who made Oak Bluffs the only planned community on the Vineyard, the only community that started with a blank sheet of paper and somebody saying, well, I think we should have a gigantic park here overlooking the water. And just for good measure, another 20 or so parks scattered throughout the rest of the town. The Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company built the forerunner of today's Steamship Authority Wharf and built Oak Bluffs' first hotel at the head of it. They built Ocean Park, they laid out the house lots along the back edge and for blocks and blocks and blocks inland, nestling a secular resort cheek by jowl up against the Methodist campground with Circuit Avenue as the dividing line. The story goes that there was once a fence, a wooden board fence on the Linda Jeans side of Circuit Avenue that was meant to keep all those reprobates in the secular part of Oak Bluffs from corrupting the Methodists during their summer sojourn with God, until the Methodists decided that the people on the other side of the fence didn't really look that dangerous after all. And besides, it got tiresome to keep replacing the boards that mysteriously fell out every night about curfew time. It was out of the secular side of Oak Bluffs that traditions like Illumination Night got started. It was to the secular side of Oak Bluffs that President Ulysses S. Grant came for a summer visit in 1873, famously greeting the crowd that had arrived to feed him by saying, "I know you must all be tired, and so am I. Good night." Thus making the shortest speech ever delivered by a nationally known politician on this island. The secular resort, represented here by Circuit Avenue and probably in the late 1880s, early 1890s, flourished beyond its founder's wildest dreams. And along its margins grew up a series of recreational opportunities, like this gravity toboggan, which lasted for about a season, and the flying horses, shown here behind it in its original location about where the Lookout Tavern is, which has lasted rather longer, albeit in a different place. Which brings us to the 1870s, the beginnings of the secular resort and the beginnings of Oak Bluffs developing a waterfront. Because if you're going to build your summer resort on the edges of Vineyard and Nantucket Sound, it's a shame not to take advantage of all that lovely water for something. As I said, the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company built the first resort hotel in Oak Bluffs. This is not it. The first hotel in Oak Bluffs, which you can find old postcards of that helpfully label it the first hotel in Oak Bluffs, is the most boring building ever erected in the entire town. In a town known for architectural extravagance, the first hotel in Oak Bluffs looked like a barn designed by a particularly unimaginative architect of barns. As you can see, they made up for it on attempt number 2. This is the Seaview, which opened in the early 1870s and was the crown jewel for 20 years of the Oak Bluffs Resort Hotel field, which, if you've ever seen a map of Victorian Oak Bluffs, is saying something. Just as in Atlanta, if there's an empty lot, the immediate response is pave it over and put up a parking structure. So too in Victorian era Oak Bluffs, if there was an empty lot, the immediate response was, well, seems like a good place for a hotel. But there was never a hotel in Oak Bluffs that was the equal of the Seaview. I mean, gas lighting in all the rooms, electric elevators, electrically wired bells to call the servants and all that jazz, towers, turrets, all the Victorian folderol you could possibly want. Of all the Victorian resort hotels on the island, it's exceeded only by the Mattakesett Lodge, which looked like the Addams family would go there on vacation. But the really remarkable thing about the Seaview is that it straddled the wharf where the steamers from New Bedford and Woods Hole and whatnot deposited the summer tourists on the island. If you look to the the right side of this picture, you can see that it's being taken from the upper deck of a steamer. There's the pilot house, there's one of the officers in his blue serge suit. You literally walked off the boat and into the shadow of the Seaview. And if you were so misfortunate as to be going to one of the other dozen or so hotels in Oak Bluffs, you walked directly past it, along that transfer bridge, and through a gateway that led to the top of what's now Oak Bluffs Avenue, about where the Santander Bank is, and into the rest of Oak Bluffs. In other words, the first thing you saw, and for a good 10 minutes walking, the only thing you saw, was this gigantic dragon in a Fair Isle sweater of a building hunched over the Oak Bluffs wharf. Now, you may have noticed that it looks suspiciously like there's a set of railroad tracks running along the wharf there, and sort of disappearing off down the coastline into the distance. And you would, in fact, be right, because from 1874 to 1890, 1942, I believe, there was, as many of you know, a railroad, a narrow gauge 9-mile line that ran from the steamer wharf in Oak Bluffs to Depot Corner in Edgartown, and yes, that's why the gas station is called that. Through what's now the West Side Cemetery and down the middle of the Katama Road, winding up at the shores of Katama Bay at the aforementioned Matakeesett Lodge. The railroad is an entirely other story, and I promise I'll tell it in more detail this time next week in the Edgartown Library when I'm doing the introductory talk on my new book on Edgartown in historic images. This has been your shameless plug for the evening. But the railroad, suffice it to say, was designed by the good citizens of Edgartown to funnel off some of those tourists who were pouring into Oak Bluffs by the thousands upon thousands upon thousands every summer. Their pockets, as the Edgartonians envisioned of it, veritably bulging with money that they unloaded with unseemly haste into the pockets of restaurateurs and hotel keepers in what was, from 1880 on, its own separate town, having had the temerity, again in the eyes of the Edgartonians, to secede and declare independence. So the railroad ran from the wharf in front of the Seaview down along the front, down along the waterfront, along what's now State Beach, and off into the wilds of Edgartown. If you walked through that gateway at the top of the wharf, that you'd find yourself looking to your left at Ocean Park, looking to your right at the Vineyard skating rink, where you could not only skate yourself, but you could watch exhibitions of trick skating and trick bicycle riding and whatnot. If you turned left at the top of the steamer wharf and walked down the front edge of Ocean Park, you'd find yourself at a gazebo where you could buy lemonade or iced tea or a tea cake or a sandwich. And then on a boardwalk that ran along the tops of the bluff, more or less where the sidewalk of the, is that Ocean or Seaview that runs parallel to the water? I can never keep them straight. Seaview. Along the sidewalk of Seaview Avenue. Why a gazebo? Why a plank walkway? Because I think every self-respecting Victorian summer resort had a walkway, a boardwalk, a paved walkway along the shore, because really where else would you go promenading with your spouse or with your hopeful spouse-to-be or whatever? The idea of, hey baby, let's go take a walk in the moonlight along the waterfront has a long and illustrious history. Oak Bluffs made sure that its visitors had a waterfront along which one might actually want to do that. This skeletal structure was a ways down the boardwalk, about where the far corner of Ocean Park is now, sort of across the way from the Corbin Norton mansion. You'll notice that it's multiple stories tall, and if you're wondering what it is, it's exactly what it looks like. It's an observation tower. In that age when 4 stories was an incredibly tall building, well, okay, 4 stories is still an incredibly tall building for these parts, but in those days when 4 stories was still an incredibly tall building, the idea of being able to pay your dime or your nickel and climb up the observation tower and see the world from a great height like that still held significant appeal. It was also a stop on the railway. You can see the tracks down there. This room here would have been the ticket office. And it overlooked the most prominent feature of this section of the Oak Bluffs waterfront, which was the bathhouses. The bathhouses were not bathhouses as we think of them today, the place where you leave your beach bag and the stuff you don't want to carry down to the sand with you. They were full-blown transitional spaces between the world of the street and the world of the beach. They contained hot and cold saltwater baths, they contained showers, they contained wringers with which you could wring out your swimsuit. Because God help you, you poor Victorian soul, your swimsuit was made out of wool. If you've ever wondered why every shot of people in the water in the late 19th century looks sort of like this, they're sort of wading around up to their waist, and they're splashing a little bit, and they're talking, and they look like they're having a grand time. But they are all absolutely as vertical as, you could set up a carpenter's square on them, and they would not be 1 degree off vertical. And in part, it's because it was the custom. In part, it's because knowing how to swim was not a foregone conclusion among the middle and upper classes of the late 19th century, especially among the urban branches of those classes. But partly, I leave it to you. Put on a swimsuit that covers you from neck to ankle to wrist and jump in the water. And you try to do 50 yards like that without winding up looking some poor bewildered flounder in the eye as you sink slowly out of sight. If I had to wear a wool bathing suit, heck, I'd stay standing up too. As we know, because we've got the placards that said so, wearing a bathing suit, wet, dry, or otherwise, on a public street was not only illegal and opened you up to a possible fine, it was also roughly the equivalent of, walking into Symphony Hall in your pajamas today. It was so not done that it would never have occurred to anybody to just amble across the street from their cottage and down to the beach and go in the water. Hence bathhouses. Bathhouses also gave you something, if you were so inclined, to sit underneath. Because remember, there was a reason why the women of this day and age all carried parasols. Malibu Barbie was still about 60 years on down the line in terms of female beauty standards, and to have skin that gave evidence that you'd spent a whole lot of time unprotected in the sun was to commit a terrible faux pas, because it suggested that you had to be out there under that blazing sun working for a living. Fishermen, farmers, laborers had tans, but people of refinement and breeding didn't. So if you were going to the beach, chances were you wore a big floppy hat, or you spent an awful lot of time in the shade. And as you can see here, the bathhouses provided that shade. Lover's Rock, gigantic glacial erratic chunk of boulder deposited by the Ice Age COD about 10,000 years ago on the shores of Oak Bluffs, was the great photo op spot of Victorian Oak Bluffs. You could climb up on it, you could lean against it, you could have your family picture taken there, notice the girl in the front. One of these days I'm going to put this picture up on Facebook and have a caption writing contest for the bubble that goes over her head. Personally, I've always thought she was thinking, I'm standing here in a wet wool bathing suit and there's sand in places I do not wish to discuss. Dad, will you take the picture already? You would think this is the steamship wharf in front of the Seaview, but it's not. It's the other steamship wharf about 150 yards further to the west, where the road now takes a right angle turn in front of the East Chop Beach Club. It was called Highlands Wharf, and it served the Vineyard Highlands, built in part because the more devout Baptists and Methodist visitors to the island didn't like the idea of having to get off at the main wharf and make their way through the outskirts of Sodom by the Sea there past the roller skating rink, past the dance halls, the shooting galleries, the places where people wrestled a dancing bear and whatnot. So a wharf was built at the foot of the Highlands where you could get off and walk right up the hill to the Highlands House, the big tall thing on the right. Or if you were a visiting teacher going to the Martha's Vineyard Summer Institute, well, you're in luck. That's the building in the center and left. And if you were going a little further into the Baptist campground where the ocean view is today, or across the isthmus dividing Lake Anthony from Sunset Lake into the Methodist campgrounds, well, there was a street railway drawn by horses that ran right up to the foot of Highland Wharf from the 1880s on. And you could hop on the street railway and cross, as they say in the day, over Jordan between Lake Anthony here, Sunset Lake there, make a right-hand turn and you're out in a few minutes, you're out on Highland Wharf. That building right there is now the space occupied by our market. And you're looking at Oak Bluffs Harbor and Sunset Lake. If you squint a little bit over at the left there, you can almost still see the contours of the land in the park. Here's the view from Jordan, looking back across Lake Anthony, up at the Seaview Hotel, looming over the lake. And this is the ruins of the roller rink after it was caught by embers the night that the Seaview burned down in 1892. Here's the remnants of the Y track on the wharf that the locomotive from the railroad used to turn around in. Another victim of the Seaview fire in 1892. Do we have a picture of the Seaview fire or even the wreckage? If we do, I have never seen it. And given the absolute preponderance of photographs of every other aspect of Oak Bluffs between 1880 and about 1925, I have to think, for whatever reason, the guy who took all those pictures, because somebody did, biggest hotel in town burns down, somebody's got to show up with a camera, apparently absconded to California with them or something, because we don't have them. Nonetheless, the Seaview burned down. Whether accident or arson was responsible, nobody's ever been able to figure out. And the world moved on. The Tivoli Dance Hall was built at the top of Oak Bluffs Avenue, where the police station is now. A new series of amusement attractions, the Dreamland Garage, a now extinct bowling alley, a diner, took the place of the old roller rink. The Dreamland, of course, is still there. For you sharp-eyed people, that's the Civil War statue in its old traffic-obstructing place where it was erected in the 1930s before somebody had a rush of brains to the head. A new Seaview Hotel was built at the corner of Waubun Park, rather less grand than the old Seaview Hotel. It, of course, was demolished to make way for a surpassingly unimpressive set of condominiums. So I guess we now have to call it the old New Seaview Hotel or something. The horse railways were replaced by electric trolleys. And the new steamers of the 1920s, like that sister ship of the Nobska there, started bringing more and more of these newfangled gadgets called automobiles, which had started to catch on back in the years just before World War I. But in terms of the Oak Bluffs waterfront, the two biggest changes involved cutting through narrow strips of barrier beach to the sea. This is a picture that literally came through the doors of the museum library this afternoon, part of a donation from the late Reverend Herman Page, who wrote the history of the Martha's Vineyard Railroad. To orient you, you're standing on the balcony of the Highland House at the base of Highland Wharf. You turn to your right, you're looking down the Oak Bluffs shoreline. That's Lake Anthony, now Oak Bluffs Harbor, there. That big building in the distance is the not yet reduced to ashes Seaview Hotel. And so the wharf sticking out in the far upper left is the Steamship Authority wharf. What you are looking at in literally the first picture I have ever seen that shows this is what Oak Bluffs Harbor looked like before it was Oak Bluffs Harbor. Before they cut through the isthmus dividing Lake Anthony from the Sound, before they opened up what had been a placid, weed-choked at the edges, water in front of the Wesley House, into an honest-to-God, dredged, jettied, channeled harbor that we all know and love. Just again, to orient you, that first picture was there looking this way. When I said that the people of Oak Bluffs made the Oak Bluffs waterfront, this is part of what I meant. So you open the Lake Anthony to the sea, and boats start showing up.
What year did they do that?
19, you'd think I would have looked that up. 1911, I believe. Give me plus or minus 2 on that. But,
So it's just sail out of it.
oh, wait. Notice that the edge of the water here is still grass and foliage and a ragged edge sloping down into the sand. It won't stay that way forever. This is in front of the Wesley House, by the way, looking over towards where our market is now and the old car barn that, well, anyway. But notice the sheer number of boats here. Some of them are working cat boats people go fishing and shell fishing in, but a significant number of them are now yachts over from other places on the vineyard, over from places on the Cape, over from Mattapoisett or Wareham or whatever. What the opening of Lake Anthony to the sea did was to make Oak Bluffs into a port for visiting yachtsmen and to make it possible to come under your own wind or eventually engine power. Or if you were visiting for an extended period of time, to rent a sailboat or rowboat at Joy's Pier or Church's Pier and go venture out into the harbor and perhaps into the Sound just beyond. It added a new dimension to the Oak Bluffs waterfront and to the nature of tourism in Oak Bluffs. The Wesley House in the backdrop there having lost its gigantic letter W on the tower. The second major pre-World War I project that reshaped the Oak Bluffs waterfront, and I apologize for the lousy quality of the map, I didn't have time to find a better one. I was lucky to find this one. Involved an area south of Oak Bluffs proper, south of Farm Pond, north of Senchic-and-Tackett, where William H. Hart bought the first in a series of parcels of land that became what's known even today as Hart Haven, because for the first 2 generations at least of people who summered there, they were members of the Hart family or close friends of theirs. Like East Chop, like West Chop, like any number of other enclaves on the vineyard, Hart Haven became its own tightly knit summer community within a summer community. And because of where it was located, it became its own, it had its own private harbor, again cut through the barrier beach to give a sheltered anchorage, a sheltered place to tie up your boat and still have easy access to Vineyard Sound. You drive up the beach road from Edgartown, look to your right today, just before you get into Oak Bluffs. Hart Haven is still there, still secluded, still beautiful. Meanwhile, mentioned at this point in the talk because there was no place else it fit logically, by the years leading up to World War II, the Highland Wharf had been taken down. The steamers had long since quit stopping at 2 places 150 yards or so apart. The Highland House had burned, again, arson or accident, we don't know for sure, and the Summer Institute had closed. In their place was the East Chop Beach Club. which became the nucleus of yet another one of those summer communities, and which, like Hardhaven, persists to this day. The East Chop Beach Club became the center of a set to with the town over access to what had been public beach, but that's another story for another day. What's noticeable, if you look at the setup of the East Chop Beach Club, is how much has changed since the 1880s. Those are still bathhouses, and on the other side as well. But they're tiny little closet-sized rooms where literally you spend 5 minutes changing in and out of your wet swimsuit, if that, and it gives you a place to stow your beach toys and whatever between visits to the beach. But the swimsuits are briefer, and people, although it's not apparent here, are actually now swimming when they're in the water as opposed to just waiting and splashing and standing around. The gold-covered Intelligencer, pick one up free if you like, on the table there has a reminiscence from somebody who was around at the turn of the century about the moment when sea bathing, as the Victorians called it, gave way to what we'd recognize as swimming, something that's recognizably athletic. World War II was raging when, on September 15th, 1944, what became known as the Great Atlantic Hurricane blasted up out of the Caribbean and mauled the Vineyard, the second major hurricane to do so in less than a decade. The 38 hurricane was more emotionally traumatic, but the 44 hurricane sank the Vineyard lightship, killed 13 men aboard her, and obliterated the last traces of the Victorian Oak Bluffs waterfront. The bathhouses, the train trestle, all the timber, basically from what's now the inkwell to the Steamship Authority wharf, was swept clean off of the rocks, off of the sand, off of the bank, and deposited like a lumber yard caught up in a tornado on top of the Steamship Authority wharf. If you look around on the internet, you can see pictures of the wharf the day after the storm. And it looks like somebody played Tinker Toys with the entire contents of Hinkley's and Cottle's. What was left behind in the aftermath of the hurricane was an essentially swept clean bank, a grassy slope leading up to the pipe railings along the sidewalk, and a flat, smooth promenade where the train tracks used to run and the edges of the bathhouses used to stand. You'll notice in the far distance, there seems to be a sort of lump of building there at the edge of the bank. And what that is the old second generation bathhouses that, instead of being looming structures built over the beach itself, were tucked back on the old embankment where the train tracks used to run, and which you gained access to by putting your coin in a turnstile or by handing it over to the attendant at the top. This is why this limited access beach, where you paid to have access to the bathhouses and whatnot, is why still today that chunk of Oak Bluffs waterfront between the Inkwell and the Steamship Authority wharf is called Pay Beach, even though, well, I'm 55 and I never had to pay to set foot on that beach. Thus do the fingers of the past keep their fingerprints on the present, which is probably also why the save icon on your computer is still a floppy disk, a technology that's been obsolete for a good quarter century. That white square thing that looks like a disused Air Force radar blockhouse is the other end of the bathhouse, refreshment stand, whatever, pier extending out into the water, and chain link fence, barbed wire on top. When they wanted you to pay, they were serious. This is Pay Beach. This is what you got for your nickel or your dime or your quarter. This would have been about 1950 something, possibly early 1960 something. Going to the beach has gotten significantly less involved than it was in the Victorian era. The other great post-war transformation of the Oak Bluffs waterfront was, like the hurricane, an accident. In July 1965, the big freight shed on the end of the Oak Bluff Steamship Authority wharf caught fire. Engines from all three Down Island towns responded, and there is in the archives of the museum a marvelous series of photographs shot in those days showing the volunteer firefighters in their t-shirts and their ball caps and their Bermuda shorts, hauling hoses, climbing ladders, and trying to keep the flames down to the point where it only destroyed the freight shed, collapsing to the deck here, and didn't take the wharf down with it. They succeeded. No one was seriously injured. No one was killed. The wharf was saved. But the freight shed, which back in the old days had been where freight was pulled off of the boats on dollies dragged by small motorized tractors and parked until somebody could come in a truck and drive down the wharf and load it up to take it to its destination. The freight shed was gone. It wasn't missed as much as it might have been. The days of break bulk cargo carrying, which is the thing I just described, where you load boxes on and off the boat rather than driving the truck in, had begun to end when the Islander entered service in 1950, the first designed for the Vineyard Run boat that you could drive in one end of and drive out the other. Once you could drive a truck on and off the boat, there was very little reason to worry about loading and unloading cargo, and thus very little serious need for a big freight shed. The one in Vineyard Haven lasted until they rebuilt the wharf in the early 1990s. The one in Woods Hole got turned into an administrative office and ticket sales area and bit the dust sometime around, 4 months ago. But if you ever wondered why the Woods Hole ticket office was so blessedly ugly, it's because, yes, it really did start as a warehouse. 1973, this one wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. This is the beach replenishment project of 1973, otherwise known as there's getting to be an awfully small amount of actual, honest-to-goodness sand in front of all the rocks on the seawall. Perhaps we should bring in some more. To give you an idea of the scale, that's a big articulated front-end loader. That's another one out on the barge there. We're talking a massive, massive project. How massive a project are we talking? Well, remember Lover's Rock about 20 slides back? And it had all those humans next to it for scale. And it was about, here to there from the edge of the water. The 1973 beach replenishment project buried Lover's Rock entirely. Gone. They didn't move it. They just covered it. And as you might expect, there was much gnashing of teeth and rending of garments, but people decided they liked a beach with sand on it better than they liked a glacial erratic that went back to great-grandma's time. And so Lover's Rock disappeared under the sand, marked today by a large flat basalt boulder. And if you've ever wondered why there's that one big old rock in the middle of the end of Pay Beach, it's because it's a marker for a much larger rock somewhere underneath. Remember that nice grassy slope running down from the road to the old railroad roadbed? Well, somewhere along the line that got overgrown, eroded away, then eventually paved over because really Asphalt improves any landscape setting. And you can see along the foot of the boulders that were put in to keep it from eroding, bits and pieces of old stumpy pilings, the remains possibly of the old railroad trestle, the remains possibly of the old bathhouses, or perhaps the remains of some of those wooden perpendicular to the shore walls that in the coastal engineering business go by the extremely unfortunate name of groins. No, really, I mean, you try to give a lecture about wooden groins to a room full of teenage boys and see how far you get. Suffice it to say, the late 80s and 90s were not the finest aesthetic hour of the beach between, say, the Steamship Authority and the first jetty. Here's an aerial view. Late 60s, the Untitled coming into the wharf hasn't been stretched yet. Here you can see what the post-war development of Oak Bluffs Harbor wrought. Massive infill development here along the area known as North Bluff. 2 beautiful rip-rap jetties preserving the channel. And all the way around the outside edges now, no longer ragged grass and sand, but vertical sheet steel walls or masonry or wooden pilings or some kind of bulkhead. So you can parallel park your boat alongside it, as along here, or back your boat into a slip between 2 pilings, as here along in front of the Wesley House. Oak Bluffs had, in the post-war era, become a full-fledged yachtsman's harbor, not just if you're out banging around in your catboat, you can nose your way in. It had become a major destination, as it remains, as you'll know if you've ever driven along Lake Avenue on some random weekend in July, or some random Tuesday morning in July. One of the things you can do with a bulkhead like that is bring in a ferry smaller than the big ocean-going steamers that were run by the Steamship Authority. That, some of you may actually remember, is the Vineyard Queen, the forerunner of the Island Queen. Started running in 1963 or 64, passenger-only service from Falmouth. The Vineyard Queen begat the old Island Queen of late lamented memory, which begat the new Island Queen, which is still, improbably enough, soldiering on after about 35 or 40 years in service. It begat the East Chop, the Crossrip, the Kateri Tech, the Brant Point, the Nautican, which my father assures me the wags of the day referred to as the walloping window blind, in reference to the old children's nonsense song. All of them docked along the bulkhead where the Island Queen comes in now, all of them bringing not freight, not cars, not trucks, just passengers, the vast majority of them day trippers. This too represented a significant change in Oak Bluffs. And let me just call your attention to the fact, there's the jetty, there's the far jetty, those people are sitting on the edge of the seawall. Take note of the sand there, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Here's Oak Bluffs Harbor today. The East Chop Beach Club, the Highland House, which you used to be able to look back along the unbroken barrier beach from, is right there. Oak Bluffs Harbor, once a lake, now one of the busiest recreational ports in this part of the East Coast. Which brings us to the present. Remember that beach along North Bluff? That's it again. There it is with the jetties, with wooden groins, with people all over it, a good, I don't know how many feet from the base of the seawall. There's the grassy expanse at the top of the seawall. But here's the thing. Beaches are fed by longshore currents, currents that move sand back and forth parallel to the shoreline. One of the artifacts of putting up impedances to that current, like those two jetties, is that the beach's down current of the perpendicular obstructions gets starved for sand. One of the effects of putting up a seawall behind the beach is to, at high tide or in storms, amplify the scouring effect of the waves that beat against the seawall. And trust me, there are entire books written about this. You're getting the short, hand-wavy version, but the physics of both those things are inescapable. If you armor your shoreline to prevent the bank behind it from eroding, you will lose the beach to high tide and storm tide scouring. If you interrupt the longshore currents with groins or breakwaters or jetties or what have you, including the ones that you put in at the edges of your property to keep the sand from flowing from your beach to your neighbors, you will starve the beaches downstream of you of the sand they'd normally receive. Here, as a result, is North Bluff Beach at low tide, North Bluff Beach at high tide, probably in the late 20-aughts. The water comes up, it beats against the base of the seawall, it scours away the sand, it undermines the seawall. You put in boulders at the base of the seawall to protect the seawall, to protect the bank, and the green grass grew all around. And the water scours away the sand from the base of the boulders. At which point the seawall, because concrete is not forever, begins to get undermined anyway, begins to crumble, begins to collapse. You can put in wooden groins to try and catch the sand and keep it from being swept further down and, replenish Pay Beach and the inkwell. But wooden groins don't last forever either. So, in the early 2010s, the decision was taken to replace the concrete seawall along North Bluff, which then only had a beach left at the lowest of low tides, with sheet steel pilings and new concrete and boulders at the bottom. And admittedly, a beautiful new boardwalk stretching from the new fish pier just north of the Steamship Authority Wharf all the way down to the jetties. And that gives us the Oak Bluffs waterfront we have today. There is, for those of you who like trafficking and irony, some not inconsiderable irony in that the Oak Bluffs Land and Wharf Company, one of the first things it did was to put up a boardwalk along the top of the bluff stretching down towards Edgartown. And the most recent significant change to the Oak Bluffs waterfront is putting up a boardwalk along the top of the bluff stretching up towards East Chop. Because at the end of the day, whatever else is behind Seaview Avenue, whatever other attractions Oak Bluffs has to offer, when the sun goes down and the breezes are blowing in off the water, it's awfully difficult to not want to just go walk along the edge of the harbor front and go, wow, just wow. So that's it for this one. Thank you very much.